Welcome to our presentation, What I Believe is Surely True, How to Correct Cognitive Errors to Promote an Open Mind in Case of Confirmation Bias. This is the structure of our presentation. I'm going to tell you about the research motivation and what is confirmation bias. Ishita is going to present the topic In Whom Can We Observe It? Rieka is going to tell about the confirmation bias in the digital age. Shayantani is going to present ways to overcome confirmation bias, and Saurav presents the topic open-mindedness. The anecdotal perspective is going to be presented by Ishita and Rieka, and then Isha will tell you the overall conclusion. So first, those questions you can read on this slide were our research motivation for this topic. We had to think about the confirmation bias and on its presence in society. What is confirmation bias? The confirmation bias is a subconscious process, so it's a case most people are not aware of. It is defined as less explicit, less consciously, one-sided case-building process by Nickerson. Individuals are looking for evidence that supports one hypothesis or own beliefs. The confirmation goes with support to increase credibility. There are two forms of confirmation bias: the motivated and unmotivated confirmation bias. The motivated form shows someone who is actively looking for evidence to support their own hypothesis. An example for that form is an individual getting told their own hypothesis is not true, so one is looking for evidence to prove that their own beliefs are true. All in all, the confirmation bias could be seen as a bias which confirms an individual's own hypothesis and beliefs. Concerning the previous slide, the confirmation bias is part of human information behavior. Confirmation biases are part of cognitive sciences. The human decisions and behavior is based on confirmation biases because individuals use heuristics in decision-making they're not aware of. But it's difficult to overcome biases because being aware of the bias does not lead to better perception. It goes hand in hand with the selective perception and selective exposure, and that's why the confirmation bias is an important topic in information behavior, especially in information gathering.
The following resources shared profound insights on what can reduce confirmation bias. 4 of these studies use experimental method of investigation, and 1 study uses philosophical argumentation to draw meaningful conclusions.
In whom can we observe confirmation bias? A study by Albert et al. Concurred that confirmation bias is unrelated to culture and higher educational levels don't tend to reduce confirmation bias, rather it manifests itself in all individuals. Confirmation bias in society. Stereotypes are overgeneralized beliefs, and stereotypical bias is a form of cognitive bias that focuses on stereotypes. These stereotypes tend to cause a divide which in turn minimizes critical thinking. Viewpoints and perspectives divide people into groups depending on their social beliefs, and due to this very division, groups become susceptible to confirmation bias, which leads to poor decision making. The ever-increasing growth in information technology and social media may actually increase one's propensity for confirmation bias rather than reduce it, as online content is usually targeted to fit our own beliefs and attitudes and can even go up to an extent to enhance one's existing biases, which can further reduce one's motivation to learn novel concepts.
Let's take a look at confirmation bias in the digital age, which is, among other things, characterized by a great volume of information available to us as individuals. This leads us to information overload and fake news. A very recent study by Goethe et al. Found that this information overload and users' limited ability to process this overload creates a stronger confirmation bias. The information overload can also lead to source bias, which is a special case of confirmation bias and defined by Vandermeer et al. As specific sources being selected consistently while others are not considered. This is complemented by the evidence of Sundwall et al., who discovered that an information, whether true or false, is more likely to be believed when the source or the endorser are perceived as credible. In turn, confirmation bias makes individuals more prone to trust fake news. And according to Zimmer et al., the consumption and acceptance of fake news is strengthened by an isolated environment, such as the filter bubble, which I will explain on the following slide. The underlying algorithms of the systems we use on the internet rely upon our existing interests, attitudes, and opinions to present us with information in agreement with those. This isolation creates a so-called filter bubble, meaning that every one of us lives in their own unique universe of information, to use the words of Eli Peresa, who was one of the first to establish the term. This filter bubble acts as an echo chamber, where similar attitudes resonate and, in consequence, get magnified, while others do not penetrate its walls. In that context, Eli Peresa can further be quoted: "The filter bubble tends to dramatically amplify confirmation bias. In a way, it's designed to." And he concludes, quite fitting to our course topic of information literacy, that a world constructed from the familiar is the world in which there's nothing to learn. However, it should be added that both concepts have recently become some kind of buzzword and are being viewed critically. For search engines, the existence of a filter bubble has even been disproven. According to Bruns, it only exists in our heads and the media diet we choose to impose on ourselves.
Ways to overcome confirmation bias. Role of disfluency. The paper by Hernandez and Preston suggests that confirmation bias is substantially reduced when information is presented in a disfluent format, as it might prompt processing of the material more comprehensively and promoting a profound analytical understanding of the information itself. Disfluency can evidently lead to critical reasoning of information perceived, reducing reliance on heuristic modes of processing. Ideological bias can be attenuated by presenting information disfluently, and it could challenge the existing confirmatory pattern, inducing a more critical analysis of the argument. This disconfirmation can be effectively brought about by ensuring that cognitive resources are available and the way disfluency is interpreted in the context of existing beliefs and expectations is factored in. Potential of preference inconsistent information. As highlighted by Schwind, learners prefer consistent information over inconsistent information. However, a preference inconsistent recommendation from a trusted source might stimulate divergent thinking and reduce confirmation bias. Education and social psychological research conclusions hint that dissenting information might help to overcome confirmation bias. Confrontation with disagreements and disconfirmatory information can motivate deliberate opinion formation. Internal conflicts are necessary to kindle cognitive development. The uncertainty which results from conflicting situations leads to epistemic curiosity. Exposure to preference inconsistent opinions has the potential of guiding learners to unbiased reasoning and informed decision making. Therefore, it can be deduced that inconsistent information can trigger more casual reasoning than consistent information, fostering unbiased information selection and effectively helping to overcome confirmation bias.
Open-mindedness is a corrective virtue. Peterson and Seligman define open-mindedness. Open-mindedness is the willingness to search actively for evidence against one's favored beliefs, plans, or goals and to weigh such evidence fairly when it is available. Al-Sharif and John Simons argue that open-mindedness serves as a corrective to the epistemic bias of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is an epistemic bias as it generally leads to the violation of epistemic norms and impedes the pursuit of truth and understanding. According to them, confirmation bias can affect epistemic agency through three pathways. Attention: we might give more consideration to information which is consistent with our existing beliefs. Interpretation: we might not give appropriate weightage to opposing information. Affiliation: we might prefer affiliation with persons, groups, or sources that share our views. Being open minded would mean consciously giving attention to countervailing evidence, and therefore, it would also encourage us to weigh evidence fairly, as more attention would be given to opposing information. We will be open to revising our existing beliefs, and therefore, our affiliation would be diverse.
Curiosity. Curiosity can be defined as the knowledge emotion providing the motivation to learn more. Curiosity plays a big role to further learn about a topic and educate ourselves. Large gaps in knowledge can make students curious, and if students are made aware of stereotypes and predictions based on their biases, they may become more curious to know if their predictions are correct. The link between confirmation bias and curiosity can be made in the sense that confirmation bias tends to thwart curiosity. Information literacy can help reduce confirmation bias by fostering critical thinking and consciousness about one's behavior, which is a key skill for dealing with information overload the digital age presents us with. Curiosity helps individuals to think more about the material and encourages deeper thinking about the information that's being presented. Now moving on towards the anecdotal perspective. In the overall opinion on confirmation bias, respondents did choose to engage with dissenting information, deeming it a necessity in today's time. Indulging with opposing opinions is generally avoided as it isn't always considered an easy task. Engaging with different social groups with diverse opinions is said to reduce confirmation bias. All respondents were willing to engage with opposing viewpoints. The quality of being open-minded was observed and considered to be desirable.
When it came to the cultural aspect of confirmation bias, quite some participants said that they believe the exposure to other cultures improves the acceptance of different viewpoints. A difference between rural and cosmopolitan areas was noted as well, making a connection between the already mentioned echo chamber to an offline context and therefore extending it beyond online spheres. And two factors that were also mentioned a lot were religion and politics, which are perceived to foster confirmation bias. This also applies to the phenomenon of polarization, which is considered a breeding ground for biases to thrive. But to conclude this part, most of our participants didn't see any differences culture-wise, but rather attributed them to the individual.
A noteworthy quote from an interviewee is that one must first become aware of the confirmation bias in order to be able to reduce it. For enhancing the situation, that is to lessen the occurrence of confirmation bias, awareness and flexibility were suggested as the primary stalwarts. Respondents emphasized upon the role of being open to discussion and listening and understanding while being respectful. Consuming content from a variety of information sources was suggested to avoid biased behavior. Another suggestion was to subject oneself to critical self-assessment by reflecting upon one's thoughts and opinions to spot any gaps in them. It was also noted that moral epistemic principles guiding an individual towards rational thought stand as a guard against confirmation bias. Overall, it can be concluded that confirmation bias can be challenged by cultivating cognitive flexibility. As an overall conclusion, we can observe that the anecdotal perspective gained from the interviews resonates well with the scientific knowledge gained from research. It can be concluded that confirmation bias is a cognitive shortcut which is visible across geographical boundaries and age differences. Many respondents concurred with the view that confirmation bias occurs because of limited cognitive ability. However, there seems to be more going on with confirmation bias than just an unconscious mechanism of the human mind. Devaluation of credibility of certain sources can occur because of confirmation bias. A variety of studies suggest that the online sphere is designed in a manner that increases the likelihood of the occurrence of confirmation bias. The online filter bubble echoes one's opinions and attitudes. Recommendation systems are specifically designed to suggest information consistent with our beliefs. Moreover, consuming information online often leads to information overload, thus predisposing us to biased behavior. From an experiential perspective, it can be noted that the distinction between right and wrong is emphasized upon in the online sphere, which often is in conjunction with what is belief confirming and belief disconfirming. With the intention of reducing confirmation bias, all debiasing strategies tend to focus on triggering careful processing of information. It can be argued that open-mindedness is a powerful tool against confirmation bias, as it enables us to transcend a default cognitive standpoint and increases the likelihood of us engaging with counter-arguments. The conducted interviews shone light upon how individuals may be hesitant to engage with dissenting information, but they see the value in being flexible. It can thus be concluded that if confirmation bias is an intrinsic feature in our biology, it is our epistemic responsibility to attempt to lessen its impact upon our thinking. On a final note, we'd like to acknowledge the several questions surrounding confirmation bias that defy simple answers. They range from the persuasive power of inconsistent information to the efficacy of critical thinking and careful processing for reducing confirmation bias. There is also the question of whether we even have the cognitive resources required to carefully process all of the information around us. How can one actively encourage open-minded thinking? And lastly, how can one ensure that measuring of the credibility of information is bias-free as well? Thank you for your attention. The following sources were used to create this presentation. The following images were used in this presentation.